I to Z Mysteries, The Skull Skeleton, by Ron Roy. Chapter 1. Dink, would you mind passing out math paper to everyone? Mrs. Eagle asked. Oh, no, a math quiz, Josh groaned. Mrs. Eagle smiled. Yes, Josh. We have one every Monday at 10 o'clock, she said. Now, I'd like to see bright eyes, quick minds, and sharp pencils. Kids fumbled inside their desks for pencils. Then some of them formed a line at the pencil sharpener. Dink liked his teacher and his room. Everywhere he looked he saw books, cheerful posters on the walls, and sunlight coming through the windows. Mrs. Eagle had brought in a rug and some big pillows for the reading corner. That was Dink's favorite spot in the room. Dink's full name was Donald David Duncan. But when he first learned to talk, all he could say was Dink. Now that was his permanent nickname. He walked to the paper shelf, grabbed a stack, and began handing it out to the other third graders. When Dink got to his friend Josh's desk, Josh grinned and whispered, "Teacher's pet, teacher's pet." When Dink gets sick, he goes to the vet. Josh Pinto was tall and thin. He had red hair that liked to fall over his freckled forehead. Dink crossed his eyes at Josh. Then he slid a piece of paper onto his desk. "Can I have two?" Josh asked, pulling another sheet from Dink's stack. Ouch! Dink yelped, looking at his finger. There was a thin cut, and it was beginning to bleed. "What's the matter?" Mrs. Eagle asked, walking over to Dink. "I got a paper cut," Dink said. "I'll bet that hurts," Mrs. Eagle said, handing him a tissue. "You'd better go to the nurse's office and get a Band-Aid." Dink pressed the tissue against his cut and headed for the door. When he passed Ruth Rose's desk, she grinned at him. "Hurry back for the quiz," she teased. Ruth Rose Hathaway lived next door to Dink on Woody Street. She had bouncy black hair and quick blue eyes. She always dressed in one color, from head to toe. Today's color was daffodil yellow. "I'll be back," Dink said. He left the room and headed toward the nurse's office. Mr. Nieder, the tall, white-haired school janitor, was sweeping the floor. He wore a metal key ring on his belt. The keys jangled when he pushed the broom. He waved at Dink. Dink showed him his cut. "Ooh, bet that hurts," Mr. Nieder said. Dink walked past a long line of lockers and bulletin boards. His paper cut was stinging, so he squeezed the tissue tighter. When he passed the principal's office, the secretary, Mrs. Waters, was sitting at her desk. Behind her, through another door, Dink saw the principal, Mr. Dillon, talking on the telephone. Mrs. Waters smiled at Dink. "Are you here to see Mr. Dillon?" she asked. Dink stopped at the doorway and held up his finger. "Paper cut," he said. Mrs. Waters shook her head. "Bet that hurts," she said. Dink nodded and hurried next door to the nurse's office. Miss Shotsky was staring at her calendar when Dink walked in. "Can you believe it's almost the end of March?" she asked Dink. 82 days till summer vacation." Dink held up his finger. I got a paper cut," he said. "Ooh, I'll bet that hurts," Miss Shotsky said. "I'll have to amputate." Dink's mouth fell open, and Miss Shotsky burst out laughing. Then Dink laughed, too. "Come on in the back, where I keep all my torture stuff," the nurse said. She led Dink through a doorway behind her desk. Miss Shotsky pointed to the examining table in the middle of the room. "Hop up there, please," she said as she walked over to a white cabinet. Dink sat on the table and looked around the room. Something smelled nice. Then he noticed a vase of flowers on a table next to a closed door. Over her shoulder, Miss Shotsky said, "I have Batman Band-Aids, Wonder Woman Band-Aids, and Bunny Rabbit Band-Aids. Your choice, kiddo." "Batman, please," Dink said. He stared at the corner of the room where the school skeleton usually hung from a hook. "Miss Shotsky, where's Mr. Bones?" The nurse had her back to Dink. "Hanging in the corner, where he always is." Dink stared at the empty corner. The school skeleton had been there as long as Dink could remember. Miss Shotsky would bring it to each classroom when she told the kids how eating vegetables and drinking milk made strong bones. At holiday time, she always dressed Mr. Bones in costumes. The only thing Dink saw in the corner was a red scarf hanging on a hook. "He's not there," Dink said. Miss Shotsky turned around. "Don't play tricks on the school nurse," she said, grinning at Dink. "I'm not," Dink said, pointing at the vacant corner. "Look." Miss Shotsky looked. Her mouth dropped open. "Well, I'll be hogtied," she said. "He is gone." "Maybe someone borrowed him," Dink said. "I don't know when," she said. "Mr. Bones was right there when I came in at 7:30. I know because I put my scarf on him." "No, someone swiped my skeleton." Miss Shotsky shook her head. "Anyway, let's look at your boo-boo," she said, removing the tissue. In about 5 seconds, she had cleaned Dink's finger and wrapped a Batman Band-Aid around it. "Now scoot back to class so I can tell Mr. Dillon about Mr. Bones," Miss Shotsky said. She grabbed Dink's hand and dropped 2 wrapped chocolates into his palm. "Thanks a lot," he said. "You're welcome," she said. "And if you tell anyone the nurse gave you candy, I'll deny it." She patted Dink's shoulder and walked him to the hallway. Admiring his Band-Aid, Dink ate one of the chocolates on his way back to class. Mrs. Eagle had her back to Dink when he walked into his classroom. Every kid's head was bent over the math quiz. On the way to his seat, Dink dropped the other candy onto Ruth Rose's desk. "Hey, what about me?" Josh squeaked. Dink grinned and slipped into his seat. Chapter 2. "Sorry I gave you a paper cut," Josh told Dink at morning recess. The cool March wind made Dink's eyes water. Gray clouds blew across the sky, and a few mounds of snow still hadn't melted. "No problem," Dink said. A soccer ball rolled against his feet, and Dink kicked it toward a bunch of kids. "Does it still hurt?" Ruth Rose asked. Her hat and scarf matched the rest of her yellow outfit. "Nope," Dink said. Then he remembered what had happened in Miss Shotsky's office. "But guess what? Mr. Bones has disappeared." "The skeleton?" Josh said. Dink nodded. "I noticed it was missing when I got my Band-Aid," he said. "Miss Shotsky didn't even know it was gone." "I wonder if someone stole it," Ruth Rose said. She unwrapped the chocolate Dink had given her. "Why would anyone steal a skeleton?" Josh said, eyeing the candy in Ruth Rose's hand. "Share?" he asked. Ruth Rose broke the candy in half and passed a chunk to Josh. Dink shrugged. "The last time Miss Shotsky saw it was around 7:30 this morning," he said. Just then they heard a whistle blow. Everyone lined up and entered the building. Mrs. Eagle was waiting inside the door. "We're going to the gym for a few minutes," she told her class. "Mr. Dillon has an announcement to make." Led by their teachers, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders trooped into the gym. The kindergartners and 1st and 2nd graders were already sitting in rows on the floor. Mr. Dillon was standing under the basketball hoop. When the bigger kids were also seated, Mr. Dillon smiled. "Good morning, kids," he said. "I have some sad news to report," he went on. "Earlier today, the school skeleton disappeared out of the nurse's office." Everyone started to talk. A 5th grade boy with a deep voice said, "Who'd steal a skeleton? A zombie?" His buddies laughed, and his teacher gave him a look. "If anyone has any information about the missing skeleton," Mr. Dillon went on, "please raise your hand." No one raised a hand. "Well, it seems we have a genuine mystery on our hands," Mr. Dillon said. He smiled at the 100 kids who sat watching him. "And I need your help solving it. So I've decided to offer a reward. The classroom that finds Mr. Bones will get free tickets to the new aquarium in Hartford." "Ooh," a lot of kids cried. Ruth Rose turned to Dink and Josh. "I've been asking my parents to take me," she said. "Me too," Dink said. "They've got a baby beluga whale." "Now you're excused," Mr. Dillon said. "Have a nice day, and best of luck solving the case of the missing skeleton." The kids stood up, gathered around their teachers, and left the gym. All around him Dink heard kids talking about the missing school skeleton. He heard one little boy whisper, "Maybe it came alive and walked away." "Maybe if we figured out why anyone would want a skeleton," Dink said, "we could figure out who took it." Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose thought about this as they followed Mrs. Eagle back to their classroom. They passed Mr. Nieder, cleaning a window. He smiled and waved. "Maybe he took it," Josh whispered. "That key ring probably has keys to all the rooms in the school." "Josh, why would Mr. Nieder want a skeleton?" Ruth Rose asked. "She's right," Dink said. "You might as well accuse Miss Aria, the music teacher, or Mr. Love, the art teacher." "Well, someone took it," Josh said. Ruth Rose was shaking her head. "But why does it have to be an adult?" she asked. "Maybe the 5th graders stole Mr. Bones. Remember when they took that papier-mâché whale from the 1st grade room and hung it from the flagpole?" "Yeah, that was so cool," Josh said. Back in their room, Mrs. Eagle told the kids to take out their writing journals. "Since we have only a little time left before lunch, why don't we spend it writing a story?" she said. "What about?" Bobby asked. Mrs. Eagle smiled slyly. "About a vanishing school skeleton," she said. Chapter 3. What did you call your story? Josh asked Dink at their lockers. It was 3 o'clock, and everyone was going home. Dink grinned as he put on his jacket. "It's called Josh Stole the School Skeleton and should go to jail forever," Dink said. "Ha ha," Josh said. "Mine's called the Skeleton's Curse," Ruth Rose said. "Mr. Bones puts a curse on all boys with red hair." "You guys are a riot," Josh said as the kids walked toward the exit. Miss Shotsky poked her head out of her office and called to Dink, "How's that finger?" "Fine, thanks," Dink said, wiggling it at her. "Well, come on in and let me give you a couple of Band-Aids to take home." "What a baby," Josh whispered as the 3 kids piled into Miss Shotsky's office. "He's just jealous of your Batman Band-Aid," Ruth Rose said. "Yeah, right," Josh said. Batman is out. Spider-Man rules the school. The kids followed Miss Shotsky into the back room. While Dink got more Band-Aids, Josh and Ruth Rose examined the corner where Mr. Bones' USU ally hung. Look, there's a footprint in the dust, Ruth Rose said. Miss Shotsky and Dink walked over to look. It looks like a sneaker, Dink said. See the zigzag tread? It's the left foot, Josh pointed out. An adult's size, Ruth Rose said. Maybe the thief made this footprint when he lifted Mr. Bones off the hook, Dink said. Could be. It sure isn't my footprint, Miss Shotsky said, holding her left foot up. Her white nurse's shoe was shorter, and the tread on the bottom was different. Were any teachers in here this morning? Ruth Rose asked Miss Shotsky. Not that I know of, the nurse answered. After I got here, I went to the teacher's lounge to make coffee. I came back at 8 o'clock, but I didn't even look at Mr. Bones. So whoever took Mr. Bones had to do it between 7:30 and 8, right? Asked Josh. Miss Shotsky shook her head. Nope. I was in and out of here all morning, visiting the first and second grade rooms. Anyone could have taken Mr. Bones any time before 10 o'clock, when Dink came in with his paper cut. Just then there was a soft knock on the examining room door. Excuse me, but could I sweep this room now? Someone said. It was Mr. Neater with his broom. Hi, Tom, come on in, Miss Shotsky said. Could I make a drawing of this footprint before you sweep? Josh asked Mr. Neater. Sure, I'll start in the front office, Mr. Neater said. And we should measure it, Ruth Rose said. Miss Shotsky gave Josh a paper and pencil. She handed Ruth Rose a ruler. Josh made a quick sketch of the print. Be sure to get that zigzag pattern, Dink said, peering over Josh's shoulder. Ruth Rose measured the footprint. It's exactly 11 inches long, she said. Josh wrote 11 inches next to the drawing. So all we have to do is find out who wears this kind of shoe, Josh said, and we find Mr. Bones and win the tickets to the aquarium. But a lot of the teachers wear sneakers, Ruth Rose said. How do we find the right one? I know who we can ask, Dink said. Mrs. Waters. All the teachers walk past her desk to get their mail. Maybe she notices the shoes they wear. Let's hurry before she goes home, Ruth Rose said. Miss Shotsky opened a small door next to her filing cabinet. Here's a shortcut to the principal's office, she said. Sure enough, when the kids walked through the door, there was Mrs. Waters at her desk. She was staring into her open purse. Hi, kids, she said, closing her purse and putting it in a drawer. Still here? We're trying to find the skeleton, Ruth Rose said. We found a footprint on the floor where Mr. Bones hangs, Dink said. It's a sneaker. We think the guy who stole the skeleton made the print, Josh said. If we find him, our room wins the tickets. Just one footprint? Maybe you should be looking for a one-legged thief, Mrs. Waters said with a twinkle in her eye. Josh giggled and placed his drawing on her desk. Do you know anyone who wears this kind of sneaker? He asked. Just then the small door opened again. Miss Shotsky peeked in, wearing her red scarf. Good night, all, Miss Shotsky said. Happy skeleton hunting, kids. Good night, Claire, said Mrs. Waters. The door closed. Mrs. Waters studied Josh's drawing, then shook her head. I usually notice what the teachers are wearing, she said. But I never see the bottoms of their feet. She traced the zigzag tread with her finger. Although this pattern does seem familiar. I feel sure I've seen it somewhere. She smiled. Knowing me, I'll think of it halfway home. Mrs. Waters glanced at the clock and stood up. Time for me to leave, she said, heading toward her coat closet. But when she tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. Mrs. Waters walked back to her desk and pulled her purse and a sweater from a drawer. First I lose my powder, she said. Now I think I'm losing my head. Just then Mr. Dillon appeared in the doorway to his office. Hey, kids. Still here? Dink told Mr. Dillon about the footprint in Miss Shotsky's examining room. Josh showed him his drawing. We think the thief was wearing sneakers like this, Ruth Rose said. Well, that leaves me out, Mr. Dillon said. He raised one foot and showed the kids the smooth sole of his shiny tassel loafer. Me too, Mrs. Waters said. She pointed a small high-heeled shoe at them. That footprint is twice as big as my feet. Chapter 4. As the kids walked home, Josh studied his drawing of the left footprint. How can we find the guy who wears the sneaker? He asked. It could be a woman, Ruth Rose said. Josh turned and grinned. What about Mrs. Eagle? He said. Maybe she stole Mr. Bones. Ruth Rose laughed. No, her feet look as small as my mom's, she said. My mom wears size 6. Let's go to my house and make a list of all the grown-ups at the school, Dink suggested. Then we can figure out how to check their shoes. Why don't we go to your house and make a snack? Josh asked. How about a turkey sandwich and apple pie with vanilla ice cream on top? How about guinea pig food? Dink said. In his kitchen, Dink found a plate of cookies and a note from his mom, say ing she was shopping. The kids walked up to Dink's room with the cookies and Josh's drawing. Dink handed Ruth Rose a pad. While she wrote, Dink went to his dad's closet and found a pair of his sneakers. On the bottom he found a circle with size 10 stamped inside. Then he got a ruler and measured the sneaker. It was 11 inches long, the same as the footprint they had found in Miss Shotsky's office. Guys, I think the skeleton snatcher wears a size 10, he said. I'll bet a lot of the male teachers wear that size, Josh said. Ruth Rose showed them her list. I got 13 people, she said. Did you count Mr. Dillon and Mr. Neater? Dink asked. Ruth Rose nodded. Yup. All the adults who work at the school. We can cross off 5 names, Josh said. Mrs. Eagle, Mrs. Waters, and Miss Shotsky all have smaller feet. And Mr. Dillon was wearing loafers today. Who's the 5th? Dink asked. The custodian, Mr. Neater, Josh said. Why cross him off? Ruth Rose asked. He wears sneakers. Josh laughed. But they're the biggest sneakers I've ever seen. I think he wears about size 13. Ruth Rose put an X in front of the names of the 5 people Josh had mentioned. Dink looked at the 8 remaining names. 4 women and 4 men, he said, dropping a hunk of cookie into his guinea pig's cage. Do you think one of them took the skeleton? One way to find out, Josh said. Check their shoes my drawing, against how do we do that? Dink asked. Just tell them about the footprint we found, then ask them if we can measure their feet and check the treads of their sneakers. There's one problem, Ruth Rose said. If one of the teachers did take the skeleton, he won't let us measure his feet. Then we'll know he's the guilty one, Josh said. But what if 2 teachers say no? Dink asked. Then we still wouldn't know which one did it. But at least we'd have narrowed it down to 2, Ruth Rose said. Then we could figure out what to do next. We'd better decide, Josh said. Every kid at school wants to win those aquarium tickets. But we're the only ones who know about the footprint, Ruth Rose said. We've got a head start. Not for long, Josh said. Miss Shotsky and Mr. Neater saw the footprint, too. And I showed the drawing to Mrs. Waters and Mr. Dillon. Pretty soon the whole school will know. Okay, let's talk to those 8 teachers tomorrow, Dink said. We could put notes in their mailboxes, Ruth Rose suggested. Great idea, Dink said. He sat at his computer, and Josh and Ruth Rose gave him suggestions. This is what they came up with, dear. We have a clue to the mystery of the missing skeleton. May we talk to or you today? Please check yes/no mailbox. And put this in Mrs. Eagle's thank you. Signed, Dink Duncan, Josh Pinto, and Ruth Rose Hathaway. Dink printed 8 copies. Using Ruth Rose's list of names, the kids addressed a letter to each.